All right. If you're serious about investing, you need to know about public.com. That's where you can invest in everything: stocks, options, bonds, crypto. They even offer some of the highest yields in the industry, like the bond account's 6% or higher yield remains locked in, even if the Fed cuts rates. What sets Public apart is how they give you the tools you need to make informed investment decisions. Their built in AI tool called Alpha doesn't just tell you if an asset is moving, it tells you why the asset is moving, so you can actually understand what's driving your portfolio's performance. Public is a FINRA registered, SIPC insured US based company with a customer support team that actually cares. Bottom line, your investments deserve a platform that takes them as seriously as you do. Fund your account in 5 minutes or less at public.com/investing unscripted and get up to $10,000 when you transfer your old portfolio. That's public.com/investing unscripted. Paid for by Public Investing. Full disclosures and podcast description. Hey, everybody, it is time for Misfit Monthly by Investing Unscripted. I'm Jason Hall, and this is the second episode of Misfit Monthly with myself and Tyler Crow, he of Misfit Alpha. Hey, Tyler.
You introduced me like we haven't been doing this forever in other ventures as well, but yeah, always good to see you, buddy. We do a lot of this.
Yeah, I feel like lately I've spent more time looking at you on my screen, chatting with you, than I spend with my family.
It's not that far off for me too.
It's not. It's really not. So for those of you who haven't heard it yet, we encourage you to go back to mid-February. We recorded the first episode of Misfit Monthly, which is a new addition to the Investing Unscripted podcast family with Tyler, who is the author and creator of Misfit Alpha, which is a great, useful newsletter that delves into obscure, underfollowed, and even in some cases unfollowed stocks that have been massive winners, as well as the pursuit of future misfits. And we've started this podcast up to share some of Tyler's learnings and his process, but also talk about the process of investing broadly. And this month, our topic is the too hard pile.
Yeah, it's a topic I thought a lot about when I got, not just recently, but also kind of throughout the entire process of doing this newsletter and like the work I did before even doing the newsletter. Like I've mentioned before, kind of the origin of this was like looking at all of the companies over, 10, 15 years or basically since their IPO. What are the companies that have like historically beat the market, and compile the list of them, line by line. And at first I started to look at groupings, like what are some of the industries that do particularly well, or what are some of the ones that do not, and things like that. And what I found when I got started is there was loads and loads of companies in what I originally considered my too hard pile to be very prominent features of this like list that I compiled. It was a lot of banks, a lot of healthcare companies, a lot of insurance companies, things that I think a lot of investors stay away from because they are complex entities that can be hard to understand. I mean, I think you and I, for as long as we've known each other, for 10, 12, going on now years, we've mostly done a lot of like cutting our teeth, I guess, in oil and gas, which energy has been historically one of those types of industries that people shy away from because it is a commodity cyclical industry, often gets lumped into the too hard pile compared to the Coca-Colas of the world or the Berkshire Hathaways or things like that. And so to me, I've just been thinking a lot about the too hard pile, like the companies that we throw away because they look really complex or just things that it's hard to explain.
I think Warren Buffett is credited with coining the phrase, the too hard pile. But the idea is it's something that's either complex, complicated, or simply outside of your area of expertise or circle of competence that would require maybe an outsized investment of time and study simply to get to the point where you can be competent enough in knowing what they do before you can even delve into the individual business. Or there's other factors about its industry that move it into that too hard pile. And sometimes it's maybe you can get the concepts, but maybe the juice is not worth the squeeze, so to speak. The chances of finding a stock that can be an outperformer may not be worth the amount of time that you would have to invest to find them.
Yeah, and for most people, we'll call them the weekend warriors, I guess you will, of the investing world, people who have 9 to 5 jobs, people who are interested in growing their wealth through individual stocks, through investing, not, I would say hobbyist plus, I guess you could say, in that realm. With limited time, some of these complex areas, complex industries, complex companies, like you said, they're hardly worth the squeeze when there are easy wins out there. There are companies that have historically been great investments. They're easy to understand because they sell products or have simple products. They have great brands, or they're incredibly durable, resilient businesses like, I don't know, taking out the trash or something like that, that we can all recognize. And so when you start talking about obscure or smaller regional banks and looking at like loan books and having to understand things like credit default risk and duration risk, it's not really for the weekend warrior. It's for somebody who can dedicate a lot of time to it. And I probably at fault for a long time shied away from a lot of these things because they were admittedly complex. But the more you stare at lists of companies that have done exceptionally well and you see these massive gaps in what I know and what is available out there in terms of market beating companies, to me, I was like, I have to change the way that I invest. I have to find a way to learn these entities in these industries because otherwise I'm leaving a lot on the table. And that's coming from somebody who, like you, this is our profession. It's our job to explore things like this. And so I found it as a real opportune time to dive into subjects and companies and entities that don't typically fit the mold of what I was used to.
Let's talk about maybe a recent example of that. And this is one of the things that we're going to talk about is Warren Buffett's talked about his area of competence, circle of competence. And to paraphrase a quote from him, it's how large your circle of competence is less important than knowing the boundaries of it, right? And as investors, particularly once we find some success, that success can create false confidence and we can start exploring ideas that maybe we don't have a lot of competence in. So I like that idea, but we have seen, and Munger, his partner, investing partner for so long, is incredibly well known for his constant, relentless pursuit of knowledge and exercising that muscle and that willingness to kind of get out of your comfort zone. So I would like if you would talk about maybe a misfit stock that you've found and maybe it was one of the ones that helped encourage you to start stretching your own boundaries and talk about that process.
Well, I mean, when it comes to things that were out of my circle of competence, at least early on, I think you could describe basically everything that I've written about so far. Because I've made a deliberate point to stay away from my my safe spaces of real estate and oil and gas and things like that. I've really tried to focus on other sectors. But just to give an example of one that I don't think a lot of people would think about is I just want to use Oak Valley Bancorp. Again, I'm not what you would say is the most articulate person when it comes to banks, and this is a $200 million market cap bank, right? It's peanuts compared to the size of the banking industry, and probably even on the list of companies that I have been following and researching for this project is definitely one of the smaller ones, but perhaps even the smallest of the we could call it the market beating bank companies. But this was a company that went public in I think 1997 and has generated close to 2000% returns, total returns. And for something that's only 200 million, that's quite spectacular. And so I went into it and purposefully went into a business like Oak Valley Bancorp, specifically because it was so small. I knew that like when I was going into banks for the very first time and dabbling into this realm, like getting into the large banks that have wealth management services and a lot of the more complex entities, more diverse offerings, perhaps a harder to understand loan book and things like that. Yeah, I wanted to stay away from that until I learned banks better. And so Oak Valley Bancorp looked like an opportune way to do that because it's basically a regional bank in California Central Valley with maybe like 4 or 5 branches. And mostly all it does is commercial loans for small businesses, local entities, and things like that. And so it was a way to jump into what was, for me, an incredibly complex topic, but at the same time, one that I felt like needed to be tackled. And for, I think for most investors and people who are just looking at a harder subject or a intellectually challenging topic, finding a way in, like an Oak Valley Bancorp, can be incredibly valuable because it can help you to lay that foundation of knowledge. Now, I'm not saying that something like an Oak Valley Bancorp, I did it because I was like, oh, I want to go invest in Oak Valley Bancorp. I did this almost on the objective of learning banks.
Hey everybody, we'll be right back, but first a word from our sponsors. FinChat.io is the complete stock research platform for fundamental investors. They have all the standard financial data on more than 100,000 stocks globally, but beyond that, they have company-specific segment and KPI data on around 1,800 stocks. So for example, do you want to see NVIDIA's data center revenue growth? They've got it. Do you like to track Apple's iPhone sales? They've got that too. Or how about nights and experiences booked for Airbnb? You guessed it, they've got it. And they just added around 8,000 ETFs and mutual funds to the platform. The breadth of FinChat's data is truly one of a kind. I use FinChat every single day as I'm researching the stocks in my portfolio, specifically when I want to see how they're doing on KPIs that FinChat is famous for. So to get 15% off any paid plan, go to finchat.io/unscripted. That's finchat.io/unscripted to get 15% off any paid plan today. The link will be in the show notes.
Investing Unscripted is brought to you by the Chit Chat Stocks podcast. That's right, another podcast you need to add to your listening rotation. My name is Brett, one of the hosts of the show, and I produce 2 episodes weekly along with my co-host, Ryan Henderson. On the Chit Chat Stocks podcast, we talk stocks from the hottest names to undiscovered gems, interviewing sector experts, studying super investors and why they are successful, and we have a fun time while doing it. Follow the Chit Chat Stocks podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and never miss an episode. That's the Chit Chat Stocks podcast.
I think that's a perfect example of beginning that process. And we talked about sometimes the effort not worth the result for these sorts of things, but that's a perfect example of an area of the market where there have been like the ratio of winners is so exceedingly high, ignoring these small local and regional banks as a cohort, it can be detrimental because you're ignoring a section of the market that has generated substantial outperformance compared to, we think of the tech stocks, for example, as the place to go find big winners. And yes, on a pure basis, the biggest companies, the most profitable companies in the world now are almost exclusively technology-focused, tech-faced companies. But the ratio of winners versus losers is very, very different. The path to investing success in tech is littered with the bones of great ideas that made bad businesses and didn't generate return for investors and lost money for investors, versus banking where, sure, there's plenty of losers. And we see the spectacularly large ones like Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank recently. And John Maxfield, friend and former colleague that writes about banking, has laid out an incredible history looking at some of the big bank failures. These public failures create this impression that may not be completely representative of the risk of banking if you invest with high quality bankers that know how to manage that risk appropriately and the potential return profile of those businesses. Let's take the conversation back in the direction of the value of knowing when to put something in the too hard pile.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's like that thesis or theory in like, I can't remember what it was, where it's like that curve where you start to know something, and after the first couple times you think you're an expert, and then you
Right.
plunge down this giant valley.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yep.
You
Think you know what you
You
don't know.
yeah, you think you know what you don't know. You know what you know, and then you know what you don't know. Right. That's
Yeah,
the
that long
accumulation of
curve where you,
expertise.
yeah, and I think in all of us have been obviously guilty of that very first part where you walk in, you take a few steps in, and you go,
Right.
"Oh, I know this," and then you probably and likely get crushed. And
Right. You don't
I
know what you
certainly,
don't know, and then you don't know what you know. And that's
yeah,
when you get crushed. Right.
yeah. So in that regard, I think the too hard pile at first, you walk into investing or first time, and I don't know, you have a first couple of successes, and it looks really, you feel like it's really easy. You know, a lot of people get their start in investing during bull markets, and it looks great, and you feel good, and you know you can do anything. You can analyze any company, and you think you're an expert within a couple of weeks, and everyone else is an idiot. But the more and more you do it,
and then you touch the hot stove.
yeah, something happens, you touch the hot stove. I think certainly with us, it was a lot of the shale revolution of the mid 2010s where
Mhm.
we watched an industry collapse over 6 or 7 years, and basically not only shakes your portfolio, but your confidence in how to invest in things, because
Right.
what you thought you knew was upended. Yeah, and we've had plenty of instances since. We had the pandemic, we had the 2022 kind of the SPAC bubble bursting event, and then before most of our investing, I would say a decent people, there's a cohort where it's like you have the recession, the dot-com boom, you keep going back further and further back. There's all of these events that are the bloodletting of the industries, and what ended up happening is with that humbling moment, you start to realize, well, I don't know these things. And so it becomes incredibly valuable when you don't know it to just set it aside for a while, because with the more questions or the more if statements that you have built into the conclusions that you're coming to with an investment, you get to 2, 3, 4 questions or 2, 3, 4 if statements, and you're like, oh, this is getting too hard. I need to step away from this. And it's certainly a value that I had, because with it early on, and I think with so many other investors, is story stocks are always wonderful, right? There's that narrative that something is going to disrupt energy or disrupt technology, and some of them do work out, but more often than not, they don't. And as a
And
result,
another
like,
one is the next whatever. Right.
yeah, yeah, often, yeah, the next Berkshire Hathaway, the next Amazon, the next this, that, or the other thing. And as a result, we all get enamored with this idea. But the more and more you start to look at it with experience, you start to go, "Now, this might be too hard for me, or this might be too complex for me to understand all of the elements that are going into it." And for early investors who are still getting their feet and like learning industries, learning how to evaluate companies, learning some, not, I wouldn't say like it's an absolute necessity, but you know, having a general pulse of the ups and downs of the economy, interest rates, things like that, and how those do affect what you do, it pays off to be able to say, this is harder than I thought. And I think for a long time, and maybe this is the nature of me being, I would say probably a little bit more conservative in financials or savings and things like that, where I defaulted to that too hard pile a lot. And sometimes that can even become a detriment, because you keep throwing away seemingly good companies because they are too hard. And that's been the exploration here. And obviously for a lot of, I can name tons of even popular companies today that I probably looked at and said they were too hard. And now they are some of the biggest companies and most profitable companies in the world.
I want to keep the thread, the idea of the too hard pile. And one of the tricks that our brain plays on us that leads us to pursue things that we don't really fully comprehend or have enough of a circle of competence in to really evaluate them effectively. And that's the sunk cost fallacy. I think this is an idea that we miss so much that I think is destructive.
In the sense of putting in a lot of effort and thinking it's not worth it, or,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, no,
continuing to pursue an idea.
I think mainly the former, where we see an opportunity because we, as investors, when we're pursuing a stock, when we're doing the research in an industry and we're putting in that time, it's because we see that opportunity to make money, right? We're not pursuing that research because we think it's a place that we're going to lose money, right? And our brains are powerful, and the biases that we have built into us that we've evolved over millennia that drive the decisions we make that work so well in our success prior to the existence of publicly traded equities don't always align with how to be successful as a stock picker. And I think sunk costs is a perfect example of that. And generally, when we talk about the sunk cost fallacy, like the Concorde is the perfect example. There was billions of dollars that were invested in designing the Concorde, and they reached a point where it was pretty apparent that this was not going to be a profitable endeavor. But because they had made those investments, they continued to make more investments, right? Despite the evidence being pretty clear that this is something we should walk away from because of that sunk cost. So the fallacy there is continuing to pursue an idea after having reached the point of acknowledgement that it's maybe not a great idea, right? And there's a cost to our time as well, right? It's not just money, it's the time that we invest. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people that have done the research into an idea and spent hours and days studying a company, looking at its competitors, and maybe coming to a kind of watered down conclusion and still investing in it, and literally said, I've spent this much time, I should at least buy some, instead of following the outcome of the time and the research, which should be to get to the best decision and being happy to accept and embracing the idea that, and Tyler, this is something I think you do really, really well. At times it's to a fault, but the conclusion of research being, yeah, no, not going to buy that. Or it's got to be at this price for this business to make sense. Or following the information until it gets to the point of whatever the conclusion is being the conclusion and the right conclusion, not putting too much weight in the time that you've done in the research to make the bad decision to invest in something that's not your best idea.
Like you, I've seen a lot of investors do the same thing where it's because you have spent so much time following a company, either by just doing the deep research early and then watching a few quarters where it has sat on a watch list for 6 months or something like that, as if because it's been on the bench long enough, it needs to now be in my portfolio because I've watched it long enough, as if it was just the time spent doing it was the qualifier for the investment, whether or not the stock or the company or the real estate investment, whatever you want to call it, was actually worthy of doing it. It can be challenging and it's a hard thing to overcome because, like we say, we value our time and we want to make our time worth it. But at least from my approach, and I think what's worked for me is the understanding that it's not a sunk cost because it is the accumulation of knowledge. It's flexing that kind of mental muscle for you to learn a new topic, perhaps learn that new topic quicker and be able to apply the lessons of what you've learned to something else. For some of the companies or things that I've looked at where you look at a business and then you start following it and then you go, wow, they're spending a lot of money on X. Well, what are the companies that do X? Because maybe those might end up being some of the better companies. You and I, when we talked last month, it was we talked about the small suppliers, vendors, or things like that, that what they do is a rounding error for big businesses, but they're such a key critical component that switching doesn't make any sense, right? And it can be hard to find those entities, and you might not have found them on first glance. If you looked at, I don't know, a Boeing or a GE or somebody like that, you probably wouldn't have noticed them until you start looking down their supplier or vendor list. And then you're like, wow, they've had this same vendor for 20, 30 years, and they've had 50% margins selling stuff to these major companies. And it's pulling on those threads and being able to tie all that together where, yes, maybe that company itself is a sunk cost. You're going to probably walk away from the investment possibility or thesis in that company. But what you've done is built up a knowledge base that's going to allow you to explore other things and be a better investor, be a better be a better analyst for other companies. And so if you look at your time dedicated to it, not just as I need to spend time so I can buy this company, instead of I'm going to spend this time as research and
Right.
expanding my knowledge base, you can I don't know if you can wholly ever overcome that idea of I have to do this because I spent so much time. But I think it's a nice little reminder that it can be the process itself can have value.
Well, it compounds, right? It's the accumulation of knowledge compounds and it improves your skill as an investor if you use it wisely and not give in to your base instincts that we all have to deal with. So we talked a little bit about Oak Valley as one example. Let's talk about some other areas and any particular companies if you want to share to highlight that in other industries that you didn't really have a lot of experience or knowledge before that have opened your eyes and that have helped you kind of flex and build those muscles that you'd never really worked before.
Hey, everybody, we'll be right back, but first, a word from our sponsors.
All right, if you're serious about investing, you need to know about public.com. That's where you can invest in everything: stocks, options, bonds, crypto. You can even earn some of the highest yields in the industry, like the 6% or higher yield you can lock in with a bond account. Public is a FINRA registered SIPC insured platform that takes your investments as seriously as you do. Fund your account in 5 minutes or less at public.com/investing unscripted. Get up to $10,000 when you transfer your old portfolio. That's public.com/investing unscripted. Paid for by Public Investing. Full disclosures and podcast description.
You mentioned earlier, and I can go back to it pretty quickly, is healthcare. Because healthcare, biotech, pharmaceuticals, the entire world of health has been one that I think frequently gets in the too hard pile, because I think at first blush, and I don't think I'm alone in this thought, but when you hear that term, you often think of these advanced, highly scientific clinical studies, biotech startups. It's certainly what a lot of investors gravitate towards in this industry. And so I think at least I have a scientific background in engineering, but I certainly don't have anything to that degree. And so it was always a little intimidating for me. But what I found when I made this list and compiled the great companies, you found these companies in the background of healthcare that they weren't biotechs, they weren't pharmaceutical companies, they weren't doing the development of drugs or things like that. They were the ones making the vials to put the drugs in, or the company that Intuitive Surgical gets all of their plastic disposable hoods for single-use operations for disinfection and things like that. And this multitude of vendors and suppliers that, to me, the more you look at them, you're like, well, these are just manufacturing companies. And all of a sudden they look much, much more like an industrial company that I feel like I understand. And it becomes like this gateway where you're all of a sudden like, well, if I can understand one manufacturing company, all of a sudden that opens up a whole world of healthcare. And then you start to look what's similar to providing equipment. Well, what about providing services? Then you start looking at diagnostic companies and the clinical research organizations who do a lot of the clinical trials for startup biotech companies, because they don't have the labs and they don't have the patient roles to do a lot of these things. And so it becomes this industry where if you look up and down healthcare, there is loads and loads of incredibly profitable companies that have done spectacularly over the years. Similar it's a comparison I've made, and it's not a perfect comparison, but the world of the healthcare vendors, it's not too dissimilar to like defense companies, where like you have the big kingmakers, you will, of like pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers like Medicare, who not only want to get good price, but they also want like a competitive ecosystem underneath them of vendors and things like that. So they'll be competitive to a degree, but they're also going to spread this around and make sure that everybody's fed and healthy to a degree that not one company pops up and is able to exert extreme pricing power over one or the other. And so as a result, you have this very healthy, not spectacular returns, but good returns on an industry that lasts for a very, very long time, that, it ends up being a very fertile place for investment. And so to me, it was very eye-popping, where it's like, you see that list and you go, holy cow, how have I missed this for so long? And frankly, a lot of investors have missed this for so long, at least in the retail sort of space, because they're, like I said, ignored mostly. Maybe one or two Wall Street analysts are looking at companies like this. And it becomes this, I don't know, for me, it was one of those, like,
The emoji of the brain blowing out of the
exploding.
skull.
Exactly.
Right.
Where
Blowing your
you're
mind.
like,
Yeah.
how have I missed this? And how could I have not seen this earlier? And so that has been one of those industries where at first it looked really intimidating, but you could find those threads of things where you're like, oh, this makes sense to me because of thing in my past. And goes back to that research idea. It's like just continuing to do the research, you develop the skills, the knowledge base, the things that can be somewhat transferable to the next thing, even if it does look foreign on the surface.
I think intellectual curiosity is useful in this regard. And I think that was Charlie Munger's real superpower, is always learning, always pursuing new knowledge. And as investors, it's easy to fall into the habit of whatever the talking heads are interested in, whatever is showing up in Google search first is being the thing that we pursue because of the momentum. And that's not to disregard those sources of knowledge. But if you're always learning, if you're pursuing that new knowledge, you're building and compounding, like I said, on your knowledge base. It makes so many other things. I don't want to say it makes it easier, but it certainly improves your capacity to explore more ideas while also having a good idea of what you're already interested in and investing. Tyler, I want to do one more thing here. There's a philosophy that you like to use to grow your knowledge base.
Yeah, it's not mine. It's actually rented. But before I do get into that, I want to pull on a thread just a little bit more, because you mentioned Charlie Munger as being the voracious inhaler of knowledge and study and things like that. And there's a book on my desk. It's called Money Masters of Our Time. The author is John Train. And he basically does profiles of some of the great capital allocators, investors of our time. Warren Buffett's in there, Charlie Munger, Peter Lynch, T. Rowe Price, Philip Fisher. It's 25, 30 people. And on their point of voracious reading, voracious study, always intellectually curious, every single one of those people profiled in this book, it fits that description to a T. Like you mentioned Charlie, but even his partner, Warren Buffett, like a guy that spends his Sunday afternoons reading 10Ks because that's what he loves doing more than anything else. A common thread among the greatest investors that have walked this earth have been incredibly intellectually curious people that spend hours upon hours. There's no way I think I'm not going to compare myself to them, because I don't even think I could even come close to the level of study or the level of intellectual curiosity that they hit. And I don't know, I would probably put me in like the 50 to 60% range of intellectual curiosity, maybe a little higher. But even when you read
you're a little
those books,
further on the bell curve than that. Not much.
okay, we'll
but
go
a little further.
7.5,
Yeah,
maybe
no, that
somewhere in
sounds
there.
about right.
And you look at and you read some of their profiles and you're like, yeah, I don't know if we'll ever get there, but it is key foundation for being a great investor is to have that always trying to scratch that itch of why. So I did want to mention that and do a shameless plug for that book, because Money Masters of Our Time is a fantastic book for anybody looking for something new reading to put by the bedside for the evening. So getting back to the analogy, it's actually not mine. It's borrowed. It's actually from the Organization of Economic Complexity. There was a Odd Lots podcast a while ago where they interviewed one of the chief economists there, but they came up with this kind of theory or description to describe economic complexity in a country. Like, how does an economy develop complexity across having multiple industries, to go from like agrarian societies to industrial societies to services and technology and all of the things that make an economy like the U.S. economy is probably what you would say one of the most complex ones in terms of diversity of offerings and things like that. And what the analogy they gave was monkeys swinging in trees, where a monkey can only swing so far from tree to tree. He can kind of wind up and try to fling from one tree to the other, but its ability to go from tree to tree or industrial sector like agrarian sector to industrial sector is going to depend on how far that jump is. And the more dense the trees are, the more those monkeys can swing from entity to entity. And our knowledge base is the same thing. We can build up a knowledge base in a certain way, and it's going to have that density, right? It's whether how dense it is going to depend on our study. And the ability to connect the dots or let the monkeys swing from the trees, if you will, is going to involve it has to involve being able to transfer those skills from one sector to the other, or being able to take sector knowledge in one thing and being like, wow, I knew an awful lot about this in industrial manufacturing. Maybe I can apply that to a more complex type of manufacturing. I don't know, semiconductors, certainly a sector that has eluded me for a long time, but
Mhm.
the more and more I learn about industrial manufacturing, all of a sudden semiconductor manufacturing looks less intimidating because it's manufacturing.
I mean, that can carry over to things like the renewable energy industry, where so much of the core business is the picks and shovels of manufacturing a thing and often operating in a commodity driven pricing environment with that sort of thing. So I love that idea of looking for parallels to things that you already understand and know, and leveraging that as the springboard to building your knowledge base into the nuances that do make these sectors and industries stand on their own feet.
Yeah, and it works in a multitude of ways, right? Because I think for a lot of people, we get interested in a company, right? Maybe you start out being really I don't want to use Netflix as a great example because I feel like that's one of those one of ones in an industry where media has been a really challenging one. So I'm trying to think of something. Okay, let's go with Nvidia, right? Because a big popular company in the semiconductor industry, you really want to get to know it and understand it, especially for people just getting their start. You pick that one stock and you can learn it intimately. Once you have that knowledge base, all of a sudden you can go, okay, well, who are its direct competitors immediately? And do that and build out the trees, I guess, if you will, around the NVIDIA tree for you to the Intels, to the Taiwan semis, to the Texas Instruments, to the AMDs. And all of a sudden, all the things start to sprout. Then you have the suppliers to all of those. You have the ASMLs, the KLA research, the Lam research. You start going down the list, and all of a sudden you have built out from that tree of one, you have built a whole jungle, if you will, of the entire supply chain. And
Yep.
that gives you a base of 20 companies to work off of. And then all of a sudden, once you have that, you can kind of understand the the flows of supply chains and the flow of manufacturing that leads you into those other industries. And so it's a I think when we got started as writing, it was how it was recommended that we got started too, where it's like, rather than trying to like go hop from company to in one industry to something way off in a whole other thing, from like consumer goods to banks to healthcare, and just picking companies that sound good, it's hard to build out your knowledge base that way. But
Yeah, right.
starting with something and then working to all the tangential and associated things first, it becomes a much more virtuous cycle of knowledge for you.
Yeah. No, I think that's broadly useful beyond how you and I cut our teeth. I think it's the same thing, is that you learn those fundamentals and then you find ways that they apply more broadly, and it leads you down the pathway to success. So as we wrap this up, any parting words or final thoughts on the idea of the too hard pile, maybe some key things you think listeners should make sure to take away from this as they follow their own investing pursuit?
I think when you're thinking about your hard pile, first you need to acknowledge it and know what you know you're good at, and what you know, the things that you can apply to the world of investing that perhaps other people might not. Even seemingly there are any walk of life that you come from, there is something that you know that can bring a unique offering to invest in. And understanding that can help you tackle those first challenges,
You
because
want
the
to
first challenge
accelerate
is
that,
always
right?
going to,
You want to remove the frictions that limit your ability to leverage that thing.
yeah, because even the first stock or the first company that you analyze is going to look really hard and challenging. It does it, or any endeavor, if you will, trying to learn to play golf for the first time or trying to play a musical instrument. All of those things look intimidating and too hard at first. But finding that key trait or something like that in your life to apply to it will help you get through the door. And then understanding like when things are too hard, especially early on, being like, don't be afraid to, even if you've spent a couple days looking at something, don't be afraid to put it in the too hard pile. You can come back to it at any time. There is an often quoted, but perhaps underquoted one recent quote of Warren Buffett recently. They're like, there I go doing the cliche thing and in investing and using a Warren Buffett quote, but there are no called strikes in investing. It's only the things that you swing at.
That's exactly right.
I often we think of investing in this sense of, oh, I missed out on because I didn't buy a company. No, you didn't miss out. It's you just let the pitch go by. You can wait. There's going to be swings down the road anytime, and it's not good, and I would say somewhat detrimental because it might make you rush into something.
A man's got to know his limitations. That's Dirty Harry, ladies and gentlemen, Clint Eastwood. It's true.
Yeah, I mean, Dirty Harry, Warren Buffett. There's so many other great quotes out there. It's not being afraid to step away from something early, understanding your too hard pile, understanding your limits early, and then just chipping away at it. You're not going to get through your too hard pile in a weekend. This is something that is a lifelong pursuit. And if this is with investing, much like when we think about our time horizon for an investment being decades, so too is our study of this. So too is the time that you have to tackle that too hard pile. And so you don't have to do this tomorrow. You're not going to figure out banks in a weekend. You're not going to figure out who's a good insurance underwriter by the end of this month or between now and the next Misfit Monthly that we do. You have time. Embrace the time that you have to do this, because it will be beneficial to you to have that knowledge base and be able to better apply it.
Whether you act on it immediately to
Or
buy or not. Exactly right. All right, Tyler, I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
It's always been fun. Hopefully we'll do this, and I would love to get some questions. So I know you guys have a lot of Q&A and a lot of mailbag stuff, but Misfit Monthly specific questions could be a really fun topic someday.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'll go ahead and make a call out for that now, and let's try to put that out on our social media. But just remind everybody, you can get your questions into us. As Jeff likes to point out, you start by giving us a 5-star review on your podcasting platform, and then you can email us or send us a message on any of our social platforms. You can find Tyler and Misfit Alpha on Blue Sky. I think that's where you're the most active of the social platforms.
Active is a overstatement, but sure, I'm there.
Air
Lurking.
quotes active. It's where you're going to find the questions. So get those questions to us to answer. We can answer next month. That would be good. And other thing that I want to end with is just a reminder too. Tyler's Misfit Alpha is part of how he makes his living. And we have a special deal for our listeners to be able to get a discount. It's a pretty good discount. I believe it's 25%. You can select the monthly plan. Instead of paying $20, it's $15. You can get the annual plan. Instead of $200, it's $150. Both are pretty good discounts, and there's some great stuff behind the paywall there that if what Tyler's talking about sounds compelling to you, I encourage you to reward Tyler and subscribe if it makes sense for you to do. If not, there's free stuff, and you're going to be able to hear us here every single month with Misfit Monthly. As always, too, just a reminder, we love to share our insights. And as we say on Investing Unscripted, we love to give our answers to the hard questions about investing and finance. But it's up to you to find your own answers out there, and you absolutely can do it. That's it for this month, Tyler. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.